A cowboy saved a black woman from whipping. The next day, she came to his cabin to pay him back. But what she offered would change everything. "Untie her," the giant cowboy commanded, his voice cutting through the jeering crowd as the trembling woman stood bound to the whipping post. The townspeople saw her as nothing but a thief who deserved every lash, assuming she'd be broken and driven out by sunset. But the weathered drifter who stepped between her and the mob carried his own burden of guilt, seeking redemption through protecting the innocent. What neither the cowboy nor the vengeful crowd knew was that this educated woman possessed something worth killing for. Legal papers hidden in her torn dress that could expose a conspiracy reaching far beyond their dusty frontier town. When she returns to his cabin, will her dangerous secret destroy them both, or finally deliver the justice that has eluded them? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The autumn wind carried dust through the streets of Cedar Ridge as Sarah Collins hurried between the scattered buildings on the edge of town. Her worn boots crunched against the dry earth as she clutched a small bundle of bread against her chest. The abandoned barn came into view, its weathered boards offering shelter from prying eyes. Inside, 3 young faces looked up at her with eager anticipation. The children sat on wooden crates she had arranged in a makeshift circle, their slates balanced on their knees. Sarah had been teaching them in secret for weeks, knowing their families couldn't afford proper schooling. She broke the bread into equal portions and handed each child a piece. Their grateful smiles made the risk worthwhile. Sarah had used her last coins that morning at Bradley's Mercantile, but the loaf hadn't been enough to feed both herself and her students. The barn door burst open with a violent crash. Store owner Bradley stood silhouetted against the afternoon light, his face twisted with rage. 2 men flanked him, their hands resting on their gun belts. "There she is," Bradley snarled, "caught red-handed with my stolen bread." The children scrambled backward, their eyes wide with terror. Sarah stepped in front of them, her chin raised despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I paid for that bread," stumbled but kept her footing, refusing to give the growing crowd the satisfaction of seeing her fall. Whispers followed in their wake. The whipping post stood in the center of town square, its weathered wood scarred from years of use. Bradley's men bound Sarah's wrists above her head, the rough rope cutting into her skin. Her torn dress exposed her shoulder where it had caught on the barn door. Sheriff Hawkins emerged from his office, his face showing neither concern nor authority. He took his position near the post with the reluctant air of a man following orders, rather than enforcing justice. "What's the charge?" he asked without conviction. "Theft," Bradley announced to the gathering crowd. "Caught her with bread from my store. Didn't pay a cent for it." More townspeople arrived, drawn by the promise of entertainment. They formed a semicircle around the post, their expressions ranging from excited anticipation to uncomfortable uncertainty. Sarah kept her eyes downcast, counting her breaths as the rope burned her wrists. Bradley retrieved a leather whip from the sheriff's office. He tested it with a sharp crack against the ground, making Sarah flinch involuntarily. The crowd murmured its approval. From the shadows between the livery stable and the saloon, a tall figure emerged. Jack Morrison moved with the measured pace of a man who had seen too much violence and carried too many regrets. His trail coat was dusty from weeks of riding, and his hat brim cast deep shadows across his weathered features. He had arrived in Cedar Ridge that morning, planning to resupply and move on before winter closed the mountain passes. The sight of the bound woman and the eager crowd stopped him cold. Memories of another time, another place, another moment when he had failed to act flooded back. Jack crossed the street with deliberate steps. His boots struck the packed earth with quiet authority. The crowd parted slightly as he approached, sensing something dangerous in his calm demeanor. "Untie her," he said, His voice carried across the square despite its measured tone. Bradley turned, the whip still in his hands, his face flushed with anger at the interruption. "This ain't your concern, stranger," Bradley said. "We handle our own justice here." Jack's hand moved to rest on the rifle slung among themselves, questioning whether they wanted to witness what might come next. Jack stepped closer to the post. His movements remained calm, but his presence filled the space with tension. He reached out and began working at the ropes binding Sarah's wrists. "You're making a mistake," Bradley warned. "She's a thief. Got no business being protected." Sarah's hands came free. She stumbled slightly as circulation returned to her arms. Jack steadied her with a gentle touch, then shrugged out of his trail coat and draped it over her shoulders. The heavy fabric swallowed her small frame, but it offered both warmth and dignity. Sarah pulled it tight around herself, meeting Jack's eyes briefly before looking away. Without another word, Jack guided her away from the post. The crowd watched in stunned silence as they walked toward the edge of town, where Jack's horse waited beneath the cottonwoods. Jack's cabin sat nestled against a grove of pine trees, smoke rising from its stone chimney into the crisp evening air. He helped Sarah down from his horse, her legs unsteady after the day's ordeal. The coat still hung around her shoulders like a protective shield. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean. A single room housed a bed, a rough-hewn table, and a stone fireplace that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Jack lit an oil lamp and gestured toward the wooden chair near the hearth. Sarah sank into the seat, her body finally allowing exhaustion to take hold. Jack moved around the cabin with quiet efficiency, stoking the fire and setting a pot of beans to warm. He placed a tin cup of water before her without speaking. She drank slowly, studying her rescuer over the rim of the cup. His movements were deliberate and economical, suggesting a man accustomed to solitude. When he finally sat across from her, his weathered hands wrapped around his own cup. "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack nodded once. He didn't ask questions about what had led to her predicament, and she found his silence oddly comforting. Most men would have demanded explanations by now. The beans finished warming. Jack served them on chipped plates, adding a heel of bread from his meager supplies. Sarah's coat tight around her shoulders. Jack banked the fire and blew out the lamp, leaving only the glow of embers to light the room. Soon his breathing settled into the rhythm of sleep, but Sarah remained awake, staring at the dying flames. Her hand moved instinctively to the hidden pocket in her dress, feeling for the papers that represented everything her father had worked to build. The documents were still safe, but for how long? Morning came gray and cold. Sarah woke to find Jack already moving about the cabin, brewing coffee and slicing more bread. He set a plate before her as she sat up, smoothing her tangled hair with her fingers. "I should go," she said, though the words felt hollow. Jack paused in his morning routine. "Where?" The simple question hung in the air. Sarah had no answer because she had nowhere to go. Returning to town meant facing Bradley's wrath. Traveling alone as a woman of color would bring different but equally dangerous challenges. "I don't know," she admitted. Jack poured coffee into 2 cups and handed one to her. "Then stay until you figure it out." His matter-of-fact tone made the offer seem reasonable rather than charitable. Sarah wrapped her hands around the warm tin, letting the heat seep into her fingers. After breakfast, she insisted on helping with the cabin's daily tasks. Jack watched as she swept the floor with systematic precision, organizing his scattered belongings with an efficiency that spoke of education and refinement. "You weren't always hungry," he observed. Sarah paused in her work. "My father believed education could overcome anything. He was wrong about that, but he wasn't wrong about its value." She resumed sweeping, but Jack continued to study her. Her speech patterns, her posture, even the way she approached simple tasks suggested a background far different from the common thief Bradley had painted her to be. By midday, Sarah had transformed the chaotic cabin into something resembling order. She found herself humming while she worked, a habit from her teaching days that returned unbidden. Jack mended harness leather at the table, occasionally glancing up to watch ended. Worked every job he could find and saved every penny. Jack studied the papers without touching them. Legal documents, property deeds, bank records. The writing was formal and official, bearing territorial seals and signatures. "He bought land," Sarah continued. 200 acres of the best farmland in the territory. It borders your property to the south. Jack's eyes widened slightly. He knew that land. Rich soil, good water, perfect for crops or cattle. It was worth more than most men saw in a lifetime. "He left it all to me when he died last year," Sarah said. "Every acre, every building, every dollar in the bank." The implications hit Jack like a physical blow. This wasn't about stolen bread or petty theft. This was about land worth killing for, owned by a woman the town had tried to destroy. "Bradley knows," Jack said. Sarah nodded. "He's been trying to force me out since the day I arrived to claim my inheritance. When threats didn't work, he started spreading lies about me. The children I was teaching gave him the excuse he needed." Jack looked at the woman before him with new understanding. She wasn't a victim seeking charity. She was a landowner fighting for what was rightfully hers against men who would use any means to take it from her. "We need to get you to the territorial capital," he said. "File these papers properly." Sarah shook her head. "I tried that. Bradley has friends there too. The clerk told me the documents were forgeries." Jack studied her face, seeing the intelligence and determination her father had recognized and nurtured. This woman wasn't going to run, and she wasn't going to surrender what belonged to her. "Then we fight him here," Jack said. Sarah spread her father's documents across Jack's kitchen table, organizing them with the precision of someone accustomed to detailed work. Legal deeds, bank statements, and correspondence filled the surface in neat rows. Jack watched her transform chaos into order with growing respect. "These records go back 15 years, she explained, pointing to the earliest documents. "Father documented everything, every purchase, every payment, every legal transaction." Jack leaned closer, studying the connections. Jack had seen similar schemes before. Men with connections and influence pressuring smaller landowners until they sold cheap or simply abandoned their claims. But Sarah's documentation was thorough enough to withstand legal challenge. "What about the territorial authorities?" he asked. "I wrote to them 3 times, Sarah said. The responses came back, claiming my father's death certificate was insufficient, and the land grants were questionable." She showed him the official letters, each one finding technical objections to her claim. Jack recognized the careful language of bureaucrats, avoiding responsibility while protecting powerful interests. "You need someone they can't ignore," he said. Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. She reached into her traveling bag and withdrew a stack of letters tied with string. The return addresses showed locations across the territory. "I've been corresponding with other teachers," she said. "Women like me, who've lost positions or faced similar problems with land claims. Jack untied the string and read several letters. The pattern became clear immediately. Teacher after teacher described property disputes, legal challenges, and pressure from local business owners seeking to acquire their land. "It's not just you," he said. "Bradley's part of something bigger," Sarah agreed. "A network of men using legal intimidation and bureaucratic delays to steal property from people who can't fight back effectively." She pulled out a detailed map she had drawn, marking locations where other women had reported similar problems. The pattern spread across 3 territories, suggesting coordination at a level beyond local corruption. Jack studied the map with growing anger. He had served briefly as a territorial deputy years earlier, before personal tragedy drove him to isolation. He understood how such schemes operated and who had the power to stop them. "Federal authorities handle interstate crimes," he said. "If this crosses territorial boundaries, it becomes their jurisdiction." Sarah's eyes brightened. "I hadn't considered that angle. But how do we reach them?" Jack stood and retrieved a wooden box from beneath his bed. Inside were letters and documents from his past life, including correspondence with federal marshals he had worked alongside. One name stood out. "Marshal Elena Vasquez," he said. "Federal investigator would take seriously." "You should have been a lawyer," he said. "Father wanted me to study law," Sarah replied, "but teaching seemed more practical for someone like me." As evening approached, they heard hoofbeats approaching the cabin. Jack grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, while Sarah quickly gathered the documents from the table. Deputy Williams rode up alone, his posture cautious but not immediately threatening. Jack stepped onto the porch, rifle held ready but not aimed. "Sheriff wants to know if you're harboring a fugitive," Williams called out. "No fugitive here," Jack replied. "Just a woman whose rights were violated." Williams shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Bradley's pressing charges. Says she stole merchandise and assaulted him during the arrest." Jack's jaw tightened. "Bradley's lying." "Maybe so," Williams said quietly, "but he's got influence with Judge Morrison. Woman doesn't show up for trial, there'll be a warrant issued." After the deputy rode away, Jack found Sarah sitting at the table with her head in her hands. The legal documents were scattered around her, representing everything her father had built and everything she stood to lose. "They're going to take it all," she said. Jack sat across from her, his expression determined. "Not if we get to Marshal Vasquez first." He began drafting a letter that night, carefully explaining the situation and requesting federal investigation. Sarah provided details about the interstate nature of the land fraud scheme, turning what appeared to be a local dispute into a federal crime. "This will take weeks," Sarah said as Jack sealed the letter. "Then we buy time," he replied, "and we gather more evidence." The next morning brought unexpected visitors. 2 women appeared at the cabin door, their faces showing the same mixture of fear and determination that Jack had seen in Sarah. "We heard what happened in town," the older woman said. "We've had similar troubles with our property claims." Sarah invited them inside, and soon the cabin became an impromptu meeting place for women facing similar challenges. Each brought documents, stories, and evidence of the systematic campaign against their property rights. Jack listened as they shared their experiences, seeing the pattern Sarah had identified spreading across the territory like a disease. These weren't isolated incidents, but coordinated intervention not just possible but necessary. Sarah sealed the expanded documentation with Jack's letter to Marshal Vasquez. As she addressed the envelope, her hands remained steady, despite everything at stake. "Whatever happens, we fight together," she said. The other women nodded agreement, and Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the satisfaction of standing for justice instead of running from responsibility. 2 weeks passed without word from Marshal Vasquez. Jack made daily trips to the post office while Sarah continued organizing evidence from the growing network of affected families. More women arrived at the cabin each day, bringing stories of lost property and legal intimidation. Bradley's pressure intensified. He convinced local merchants to stop selling supplies to anyone who supported Sarah. The bank refused to honor drafts from accounts belonging to the women involved in her documentation efforts. Even the doctor declined to treat a child whose mother had spoken publicly about her land troubles. Sarah worked by lamplight each evening, writing letters to territorial newspapers and government officials. Her correspondence network stretched across 3 territories now, connecting teachers, property owners, and legal advocates who were beginning to coordinate their resistance efforts. "We need more time," she told Jack as another rejection letter arrived from the territorial capital. "The evidence is overwhelming, but no local authority will act on it." Jack studied the map Sarah had expanded with new cases. Red marks indicated properties under dispute, while black marks showed land already seized through questionable legal proceedings. The pattern was unmistakable. "Bradley's moving faster," he said. "He knows what we're doing." That afternoon brought unexpected visitors. A well-dressed man in an expensive suit rode up with 2 armed escorts. Jack recognized the type immediately. Government official, probably territorial level, certainly corrupt. The man introduced himself as Territorial Judge Harrison Morrison. His smile never reached his eyes as he dismounted and approached the cabin porch where Jack waited. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Morrison said with false warmth, "I understand you've been harboring a fugitive from justice." "I'm harboring no one," Jack replied. "Miss Collins is a guest in my home." Judge Morrison's expression hardened slightly. Judge Morrison laughed condescendingly. "Young woman, you're hardly in a position to make demands. The charges are sufficient, and the evidence speaks for itself." Jack moved closer to Sarah, his presence a clear statement of protection. "She has the right to proper legal representation and access to evidence." "Which she'll receive," Judge Morrison said smoothly, "at the appropriate time and place." After the judge left, Sarah paced the cabin floor with barely contained energy. Jack had never seen her so agitated, but also never so determined. "He's been bought," she said. "Everything about him screams corruption." Jack agreed. The judge's expensive clothes, his casual dismissal of legal procedures, and his obvious coordination with Bradley painted a clear picture of organized fraud. "We could leave," Jack suggested. "Head north to Wyoming territory where they don't have jurisdiction." Sarah stopped pacing and faced him directly. "Running won't solve anything. Other women will still lose their property. The fraud will continue." That evening, Sarah made a decision that surprised even Jack. Instead of preparing for flight or surrender, she began writing furiously. Letter after letter flowed from her pen, each one addressed to a different contact in her teaching network. "What are you doing?" Jack asked. "Calling in every favor I've ever earned," Sarah replied without looking up from her work. "Every teacher, every family I've helped, every connection my father made during his business dealings." She sealed each letter with determination that impressed Jack. Whatever she was planning, it went far beyond anything they had attempted before. The next morning brought the first response to Sarah's urgent appeals. A rider arrived before dawn with a telegram that made Sarah smile for the first time in days. "Federal Marshal Elena Vasquez will arrive Cedar Ridge tomorrow," she announced. "She's bringing federal warrants and authority to investigate interstate land fraud." Jack stared at her in amazement. "How did you manage that?" Sarah held up several telegrams that had arrived during the night. "My father's business partner now works for the Territorial Railroad Commission. He forwarded our evidence to federal authorities with a formal complaint about fraud affecting interstate commerce." The scope of Sarah's network became clear as more telegrams arrived throughout the day. That afternoon, Marshal Vasquez arrived with 2 deputy marshals and a territorial prosecutor. Jack recognized her immediately, despite the years that had passed. Still tall and imposing, with the quiet authority that had made her legendary among law enforcement officers. She dismounted and approached the cabin with professional efficiency. Jack stepped onto the porch to greet her, noting the federal badges and official documentation she carried. "Jack Morrison," she said with a slight smile. "I should have known you'd be involved in something like this." Sarah joined them, her documentation already organized for federal review. Marshal Vasquez studied her with the careful attention of an experienced investigator. "Miss Collins," she said, "your evidence packet was very thorough. We verified most of the interstate connections and identified federal crimes." Sarah's relief was visible. "Then you can stop them?" "We can try," Marshal Vasquez replied, "but we'll need your testimony and cooperation to build cases against all the participants." Judge Morrison arrived an hour later with Bradley and several armed men. His confident demeanor evaporated when he saw the federal marshals and their official documentation. "This is still a territorial matter," he protested. "Local courts have jurisdiction." Marshal Vasquez stepped forward, her federal badge clearly visible. "Not anymore. This is now a federal investigation into interstate fraud and conspiracy." Sarah watched as the men who had seemed so powerful suddenly appeared small and uncertain. Federal authority trumped local corruption, and their network of influence meant nothing against legitimate law enforcement. "You're all under federal investigation," Marshal Vasquez announced. "Anyone attempting to interfere with witnesses or evidence will face additional charges." Bradley's face had gone pale. Judge Morrison shifted nervously, clearly recognizing that their scheme had been exposed at a level they couldn't control or influence. Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since her father's death, the satisfaction of justice finally beginning to work as it should. The federal hearing convened in Cedar Ridge's town square, the same location where Sarah had nearly faced the whip. Marshal Vasquez had arranged for a temporary courtroom to be established under canvas tents, creating an official atmosphere that commanded respect from the table, both men looking significantly less confident than they had during previous encounters. Their expensive lawyer had arrived from the territorial capital, but federal charges carried weight beyond local influence. Marshal Vasquez called the proceedings to order. Her voice carried across the square as she explained the federal government's interest in interstate fraud and conspiracy charges that crossed territorial boundaries. "The court will hear testimony regarding systematic efforts to defraud legitimate property owners through coordinated legal intimidation and bureaucratic manipulation," she announced. Sarah rose when called to testify. She approached the witness stand with steady steps, her years of teaching experience serving her well in the formal setting. Every eye in the square focused on her as she raised her right hand to take the oath. The federal prosecutor guided her through her testimony with careful questions. Sarah presented her father's documentation, explaining how Samuel Collins had legitimately acquired his property through years of hard work and careful investment. "These records show clear legal ownership of 200 acres, she said, holding up the original deed. "My father paid full price and completed all required territorial filings." Bradley's lawyer objected repeatedly, claiming the documents were forgeries or invalid due to technical irregularities. Each objection was overruled as Sarah produced additional evidence supporting her claims. Sarah then described the systematic harassment she had faced since arriving to claim her inheritance. The refusal of territorial officials to process her paperwork, the intimidation tactics used to force her from her property, the coordinated effort to destroy her reputation and livelihood. "Mr. Bradley threatened me directly," she testified. "He said no woman like me would ever own prime farmland in his territory." The prosecutor introduced evidence from other victims across multiple territories. Woman after woman had faced identical tactics. Property disputes were initiated using questionable legal procedures. Territorial officials delayed processing legitimate claims while rushing through seizure orders for connected buyers. Sarah's network of correspondence had documented a clear pattern. The same lawyers, judges, and business owners appeared in case after case. The same irregular procedures were used to challenge legitimate ownership. The same buyers acquired disputed properties at below-market prices. When Sarah finished her testimony, "Accumulate such extensive evidence?" the lawyer asked condescendingly. Sarah's response was measured and firm. "I expect this court to evaluate evidence based on its accuracy, not assumptions about who compiled it." The prosecutor then called other victims to testify. Each woman told a similar story of legal harassment and property theft. The cumulative effect was overwhelming. What had appeared to be isolated local disputes was clearly organized criminal conspiracy. Marshal Vasquez presented federal evidence gathered from multiple territorial offices. Bank records showed suspicious patterns of property transfers. Court filings revealed identical language in supposedly independent legal challenges. Telegraph records documented coordination between participants across territorial boundaries. Bradley's defense crumbled under federal scrutiny. His lawyer could not explain the systematic nature of the fraud or the interstate coordination that elevated local crimes to federal jurisdiction. Judge Morrison attempted to claim ignorance of the broader conspiracy. He insisted his decisions were based on legal precedent and territorial law. But federal investigators had documented his financial relationship with Bradley and other participants. "Your bank records show payments from Mr. Bradley coinciding with favorable court decisions," the prosecutor noted. "Can you explain these transactions?" Morrison's stammering response satisfied no one. The evidence of judicial corruption was clear and damning. Sheriff Hawkins surprised everyone by requesting permission to testify for the prosecution. He admitted to pressure from Bradley and other influential citizens to ignore evidence and refuse protection for women reporting property disputes. "I was told these weren't real crimes," he said quietly. "Just property disputes that should be handled by lawyers and judges." His testimony revealed the extent of local official complicity in the fraud scheme. Even law enforcement had been compromised through pressure and misinformation. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the square, Marshal Vasquez called for closing arguments. The federal prosecutor summarized the evidence of systematic fraud, conspiracy, and civil rights violations that warranted federal intervention. Bradley's lawyer made a final, desperate attempt to portray the charges as federal overreach into local matters. His argument fell flat against the overwhelming evidence of interstate criminal activity. Marshal Vasquez retired to consider the evidence. Justice, with the same determination he had shown building his legacy. When Marshal Vasquez returned, the square fell silent. She stood before the assembled crowd with the authority of federal law behind her pronouncement. "The evidence clearly establishes systematic fraud, conspiracy, and civil rights violations," she announced. "Federal warrants are hereby issued for the arrest of Bradley Morrison, Judge Harrison Morrison, and their co-conspirators." The crowd erupted in mixed reactions. Supporters of the defendants protested angrily, while victims of the fraud scheme wept with relief. Sarah remained composed, but Jack saw tears streaming down her cheeks. Federal deputies moved to arrest Bradley and Judge Morrison. Both men were read their rights and informed they would face trial in federal court, where local influence could not protect them. Sarah's property rights were officially restored. The federal government ordered immediate return of all illegally seized properties to their rightful owners. Victims would receive compensation for their losses and legal expenses. As the proceedings concluded, townspeople approached Sarah to offer apologies and congratulations. Some who had jeered at her whipping post now sought her forgiveness for their previous behavior. The transformation was remarkable, but incomplete. Real change would take time, and continued vigilance from people willing to stand for justice. 3 months after the federal hearing, Sarah stood on the porch of her newly built schoolhouse, watching children of all backgrounds arrive for morning lessons. The single-room building sat on a gentle rise overlooking her restored property, its windows catching the early sunlight that streamed across the valley. Jack approached from the barn, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. He carried a steaming cup of coffee and wore the satisfied expression of a man who had found his purpose. The transformation in both of them was remarkable. 23 students today, Sarah announced as she accepted the coffee gratefully, including the Morrison children. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Judge Morrison's family had lost their home when federal authorities seized his assets, but Sarah had insisted their children deserved education regardless of their father's crimes. The gesture had begun healing wounds that might otherwise have festered for generations. Inside the schoolhouse, Sarah moved between rows of wooden desks with the confident school administrator, maintaining the building and grounds while helping with practical lessons about farming and land management. His partnership with Sarah had evolved into something deeper than either had initially expected. The morning lessons proceeded smoothly until a commotion outside drew everyone's attention. A wagon approached, carrying Marshal Vasquez and several federal officials. Sarah stepped onto the porch to greet them, wondering what had brought federal authorities back to Cedar Ridge. "Miss Collins," Marshal Vasquez said as she dismounted, "we're here with good news and an offer." She handed Sarah an official document bearing federal seals and signatures. Sarah read quickly, her eyes widening as she absorbed the contents. "The Territorial Education Commission wants to offer you the position of Regional School Supervisor," Marshal Vasquez explained. "Your success here has attracted attention at the highest levels." The appointment would make Sarah responsible for establishing schools across 3 territories, with full federal backing and substantial funding. It was an opportunity beyond anything she had dreamed possible during her darkest days. Jack read the document over her shoulder, his expression unreadable. The position would require extensive travel and relocation to the territorial capital. It was exactly the kind of recognition Sarah deserved, but it would separate them permanently. "I need time to consider this," Sarah said carefully. Marshal Vasquez nodded, understanding. "The offer remains open. Federal authorities are committed to expanding educational opportunities, and your work here proves it can be done successfully." After the federal officials departed, Sarah sat at her desk in the empty schoolhouse. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating the maps and charts she had created to make learning engaging for her diverse students. Jack entered quietly and took a seat at one of the student desks. His large frame looked comical in the small chair, but his expression was serious. "It's a good opportunity," he said finally. Sarah set down the federal document. "It would mean leaving everything we've built here." "You could build even more there," Jack replied. "Help hundreds of children instead of dozens." The conversation that followed was difficult, but necessary. Both recognized the significance of the federal offer and what accepting it would mean for Sarah's future. The woman who had once faced a whip beside the creek that marked the eastern boundary. Something that would last beyond his lifetime. Jack understood what she was really saying. The schoolhouse, the restored community relationships, and their partnership represented the kind of permanent, positive change Samuel Collins had envisioned. The next morning brought Sarah's decision. She gathered her students in the schoolhouse and explained that she would be staying in Cedar Ridge permanently. The federal position would go to someone else, but her work here was far from finished. Instead, she announced plans to expand the school into a full academy with boarding facilities for students from distant areas. Jack would oversee the agricultural program, while she developed advanced curricula in law, business, and civic leadership. The expansion required significant investment, but Sarah's restored inheritance provided the necessary funding. More importantly, the project had support from families across the territory who had witnessed the positive changes in Cedar Ridge. Construction began immediately on additional buildings. The academy would accommodate 50 students and serve as a model for educational institutions throughout the territorial system. Sarah's vision extended beyond simple literacy to creating informed citizens capable of protecting their rights. Jack proposed to Sarah on Christmas Eve as they stood in the completed academy chapel. His simple words carried the weight of everything they had built together. "Will you marry me and help me be worthy of what we've created here?" Sarah's acceptance was equally simple and profound. "Yes, because together we can do more than either of us could accomplish alone." Their wedding took place in the schoolhouse the following spring, attended by students, families, and community leaders from across the territory. Marshal Vasquez served as Sarah's witness, while Sheriff Hawkins, now reformed and effective, stood with Jack. The ceremony symbolized not just their personal union, but the transformation of an entire community. Where hatred and corruption had once flourished, education and justice now provided hope for future generations. 5 years later, the Cedar Ridge Academy had become the most respected educational institution in the territorial system. Sarah's students went on to become teachers, lawyers, business owners, and civic leaders throughout the region. Jack managed both. Humiliation for stealing bread had become one of the most respected educators in territorial history. Her story inspired others facing similar challenges to stand firm in their pursuit of justice and equality. Cedar Ridge had transformed from a place of corruption and hatred into a community that welcomed diversity and celebrated achievement. The change hadn't been easy or complete, but it was real and lasting. Sarah and Jack's children would grow up in a world where education was valued above prejudice, where justice was available to all citizens, regardless of background, and where one person's courage could indeed change an entire community's future.